Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 27th of November 2024. Today we're pleased to welcome HMRC to the committee, and we want to talk to them about their work. And this is our first session with HMRC in this session. So I'm delighted to welcome Sir Jim Harra, the Permanent Secretary and Chief Executive of His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. He's joined by Myrtle Lloyd, who's the Director General for Customer Services at HMRC, and Holliday, the Chief Finance Officer as well at HMRC. So Jim, this might be, well, perhaps not quite your last time in front of us. We might squeeze you in one more time, but we know that you will be standing down as Permanent Secretary. Can I ask what's happening about recruiting your replacement?
Yes, so I'm. Good afternoon, Chair. I'm due to retire in the spring, and the exercise to recruit my successor is already underway. In fact, I believe interviews have been held already.
Oh, all right, that's hot news. And I mean, when you said you were standing down, did you have a time frame in mind? Have you been asked to extend your stay at all?
Yes, I did extend. So I was my 5-year appointment was up last month, but I agreed to extend by 6 months, mainly because of the general election and the new government.
Well, okay, it's your loss, but it's our gain that you're here and so knowledgeable about the subject. So it's perhaps not a surprise to you that I wanted to kick off by just asking some questions about the issues around tax on farms. This has obviously been an issue that's a big issue in the budget that's affected a lot of people. And one of the things that HMRC, obviously not responsible for the policy, that is a matter for the Treasury, and the Chancellor was in front of us explaining the position just a few weeks ago. But I really wondered what data HMRC has, first of all, on farms, their sizes, and how you would feed that into the Treasury when it was making its decision.
Yes, so we have, what we have really is data on estates for inheritance tax purposes. So we have data on all estates where there were claims for relief in the past, and that's really what the analysis that we provided. So we don't have data about farms so much as data about deceased people's estates, but obviously that includes how much relief has been claimed, and that is the basis of the analysis that we provided to ministers for the purposes of their decision making, and also to assist the OBR with the costing of the measure.
Okay, so some taxes are more specific to farms. Do you not have any data to break that down, so that you can provide where estates have claimed taxes are relating to agricultural activity? Yes,
we've got precise data about exactly the number of estates that claimed agricultural property relief and how much relief they claimed. So that is comprehensive data about the use of the relief, and that was what we used to analyse, for example, how many estates would be affected by the changes in policy.
So do you, because obviously working farms may pay other taxes while they're working other than inheritance or other reliefs, do you have any information about the number of working farms that are actually producing food rather than estates that are farmland?
I'm not sure what your definition of that is, but our
ones that are produced, so they would have animals or produce food. So they're arable or livestock farms that are actually producing things into the food. So they're actually working farms rather than small holdings where perhaps there's a farmhouse, but the land around it is no longer being productively farmed.
That's not the kind of data we would hold for the purpose of inheritance tax. So it's really valuation of agricultural property and ownership of it.
Yeah. So, but for inheritance tax, but if you're a working farmer and you're paying other taxes through the system, through self-assessment, you would have some record of that. Do you match that up to inheritance tax?
I'm not sure. You're right. We obviously have data if someone has a farming business and is submitting self-assessment returns with income or loss gains, profits or losses, then we do have that. But there's not necessarily a match between who runs the farming business and who owns farmland for the purposes of inheritance tax.
Okay, so you don't. And do you know how many farms have been bought by large international corporations? Because of the international taxation issue, would that be something that you would have any information
on? I can check. I'm not aware, but I can check.
So the rules on inheritance tax are obviously, it might be helpful if you could just lay out very simply for people who have been perhaps confused about this, what your take is on what farms would have to pay inheritance tax, and what would happen what's the thresholds and so on, if you could just lay out.
So I think the Chancellor has written to the committee and given some of this information, but
I thought maybe hearing it from the horse's mouth might be clearer than some of the data.
I'm not an expert in inheritance tax, but I shall have a go. So the relief is on top of other exemptions and reliefs, such as the spousal exemption. So that is applied first, and then if there is land that is liable to inheritance tax but would qualify for the relief, then the relief is given on top of that. At the moment, that is a 100% uncapped relief, but in the future will be capped at £1 million for the 100% relief, and then thereafter will be relieved at a 50% rate. So it depends on the circumstances of the deceased person and who they leave their estate to, how much exemption they can apply before agricultural property relief, but it can be up to £3 million if you've got property left to a spouse and if you've got a residence included in that.
Okay. So, have you got any information, Ms. Lloyd, about customers ringing up asking about this? Do you keep any data on the people contacting the helpline who might be asking questions about farms and inheritance tax?
We haven't seen an increase in inquiries on that, but I can get you exact figures.
Okay, that would be helpful. And has there been any consideration in setting up a helpline for people raising questions about this, especially dedicated line?
That's not our intention. I mean, obviously there's a very small number of estates likely to be affected by this, and we have an existing IHT service which can help people. Also, most people are represented. There's a professional executor involved and professional agents involved as well.
So you're really relying on their accountants, but you have an existing specialised hotline. Okay, that's helpful to know. Just before I pass over, we've had 24 years since self-assessment went in digital, but inheritance tax won't be going digital for a few years yet. Do you think if you'd had a digital inheritance tax, there would have been better information you could have provided the Treasury when it was making these decisions?
So we do intend to implement a digital service for inheritance tax. That doesn't necessarily change the data that people will provide, so it won't necessarily give us additional data. In the case of this analysis, it has meant that we've had to analyse data that's been submitted to us on paper, so it is a bigger chore, if you like, for our analysts, and therefore that data would have been more easily accessed. But we have nevertheless done a sort of comprehensive review of data.
How out of interest, how long did that take? You must have had some notice, presumably, from the Treasury, but how long does it take to do it manually?
Yeah, I mean, I think we already do that in advance. We don't necessarily wait until a politician says what they're interested in. We sort of anticipate what people might be interested in, and we obviously publish a lot of data about inheritance tax relief, so we already do quite a bit of analysis for that. But we do expect, for other reasons, the number of estates that are liable for inheritance tax to grow in coming years, and therefore it's important that we do implement a digital service, because the paper-based service will become more and more costly to operate.
Thank you. Glenn MP.
Yes, could I ask you about the incidence and value and revenues from business rollover relief, where individuals sell a business asset, buy land and defer CGT? Do you have, that is commonly seen as a mechanism by which wealthy non-farmers have created the mechanism to avoid tax. Is that, what data, what revenue does is essentially there's revenue foregone, consequential of that activity. That would have been surely an option that would have been evaluated in the process of preparing for the budget. Can you say anything about that?
So you're talking about the capital gains tax?
Yes. Rollover relief, yeah.
So I can't really say what options ministers will have looked at during that process, because that's really a matter between officials and ministers. But and I'm not sitting here, I don't really know precisely what data we have regarding rollover relief in CGT.
I think it would be helpful for the committee to receive a letter from you or your colleagues setting out how rollover relief works at the moment, and what you think it actually constitutes in terms of the saving from CGT?
I can certainly do that. We do publish already sort of comprehensive data on tax reliefs, and I will check obviously what we've got on rural relief specifically.
Okay. And if I could just return to the Chair's questioning, I mean, the key debate that we've seen over the weeks is how this change in inheritance tax relief will affect and who it will affect. And but what I think I'm hearing from you is that you don't really have definitions of those different classifications of farm. So you just got historic data on who's claimed previously, but there is no sort of working definitions of making distinctions between a property with a few acres or property with several tens or hundreds of acres or a landed estate. It is really about just the value of those estates as it affects the incidence of tax. So you don't collect data classified by a size of farm.
That's correct. I mean, the relief doesn't have the kind of categorisations that the committee has mentioned, and therefore we don't collect that data for the purposes of administering the relief. But what we have is data on all of the relief case by case that's been given over the years, and we were able from that to calculate the number of estates that we expect to have to pay more tax as a result of the policy change, and how much.
So how do we account for this discussion around working farms? From your perspective, there is no actual definition of a working farm.
There's no formal definition. I mean, obviously, there is £1 million 100% exemption threshold, and that obviously covers farms up to a certain size. So, smaller farms could be wholly within that exemption together with the other reliefs. Larger farms would be more likely to be affected, but we don't categorise the relief by the types of definition that the committee has mentioned.
Okay. Thank you. Bobby Dean, MP.
Just to follow on from the two lines of questioning, you mentioned that you do have data on farming businesses, and then you've got separate data about who claimed for estates. Would it be possible to make a formal definition if you dug into the existing data sets you got, or would you need to go gather new data to be able to make that kind of definition of what a working farm is versus an estate listing?
Well, I mean, any farm that is where someone is making returns on the basis that they're going to be taxable on the profits or have allowable losses are working farms in the sense that they must be being run with a view to making a profit, otherwise they would not be within that. So anyone who is, has farmland that is for a hobby, for example, where they're not intending to make a profit would not be subject to being returned under self-assessment. But the person making the return under self-assessment on the farming business is not necessarily the owner of the land. They could be a tenant farmer, for example. So there's not a match-up between the ownership of estates and the ownership of the businesses.
So you don't have any cross-referencing with the Rural Payments Agency and those interactions with the estate? I mean, one view could be that if an entity is in receipt of or is registered for with the Rural Payments Agency, they may can constitute a farming enterprise, but you don't have any need for that, and you don't make any interrogation of their status with respect to the RPA.
We may well do for self-assessment. Certainly, from time to time, the question may arise, or a dispute may arise between us and the taxpayer, whether a farm is being run as a farming business with a view to profit, and that's the kind of thing that we would then look at to assess whether we believe that that's the basis on which it's being run. But for the purposes of the inheritance tax relief, the focus is on the sort of status of the land and the ownership of it. So be less likely, I think, for inheritance tax purposes that we would need to do that. The key issue there is the valuation of the property.
Do you have any assessment of people who may be doing this as an avoidance thing? So, for example, you could own agricultural land, have sheep roaming on it, have some cottages that belong to the original farm that are let as Airbnbs or holiday lets, which is the main business. Those sheep might not produce anything useful. I mean, not in the food chain, might be just grazing. would you know then if that was, would that be legitimate? And if not, how would you know?
Yes, I mean, I'm not aware that tax avoidance has been... by tax avoidance, I mean the use of relief for the purpose for which it's not intended is a significant problem. Clearly, there's lots of evidence that it is an IHT planning tool, but that has been long accepted that is something that people could do. So we would not be challenging people who buy agricultural property just because one of their motivations is that it will reduce their inheritance tax bill in the future. That has been something that has been within the law. So I'm not aware that avoidance in the sense of things that we would want to challenge has been a particular feature of it. But it has long been an issue in income tax, whether people who report, say, losses on farming are genuinely trading with a view to profit and therefore should be allowed those losses or are not, and therefore should not
That's
be allowed.
more the way you focus your attention.
That's where we focus. Yeah.
Okay. And how many inquiries do you open into IHT inheritance tax claims on agricultural land?
I don't have that
you don't know. Is it possible to write to us? It would be very helpful to know, and what that raises in addition, because I know that you have been, the revenue has been looking in more detail at inheritance tax. I think the last figures I saw was if you're getting an extra 20,000, if someone owes 70,000, you've gone and investigated, they might be owing 90,000. So those are the margins on not on farmland but on others. So it'd be interesting to know what the situation is with farmland. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Wrigley, did you want to go in?
I'm all right.
Oh, no, okay. Okay, we're going to move on to something else. So Rachel Blake MP.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and it's good to meet you. I wanted to probe some of the budget measures to close the tax gap. I'm particularly interested in the table which sets out some of the measures. And number 19, increasing tax receipts from modernising HMRC systems and data, anticipated an additional 35 million in the next financial year. Could you elaborate on what that line will incorporate in terms of your activities?
Yes, so that's mainly systems that we use for risk assessment. So if we improve our systems and improve the data in them, then we can get better at risk assessing cases and therefore, if you like, have a higher hit rate on the cases that we investigate. So it's a constant need to update those systems. Similarly, the systems that our Fraud Investigation Service use to analyse data, because sometimes we've got very large volumes of documentation that have to be analysed. If we can improve then we can improve our productivity and bring in more tax revenues with the same resources as a result.
Could you just give us a little bit more detail on what those systems might include? We've got some questions further on in the session about AI and analysis, but what exactly will you be doing? Are you seeking to find more complex cases to raise significantly larger sums in fewer investigations, or is it some flatter, smaller sums across more investigations? What's your plan?
I think it's both. Certainly, when it comes to using our specialist resource in Fraud Investigation Service, it is our aim that they are focused on higher value cases, and therefore the better we are at assessing, identifying those and also analysing the data within them, the more we can get from that. But also, if you take the more mass market cases, for example, in our individuals and small business compliance, it's really more about improving the hit rate and reducing the extent to which we take up inquiries in cases where there is no adjustment to tax required. That obviously makes us more productive. It's also better for the taxpayer because compliant taxpayers aren't get caught up in a compliance inquiry as a result. So it is really both. In terms of AI, so we do already...
We'll come on to AI separately, because I wanted to understand this system. Is it something that you're going to be allocating more resource to? Is that how you're changing the system? You're moving more people onto the investigations, or what is it that you're changing in the system?
So there are different categorizations. I mean, in addition to the funding, the investment that we're getting to improve our systems, we're also getting funding for additional staff, compliance staff, and that's a separate line in the table. So that the investment in systems is specifically about improving our case management systems and our risk assessment systems to make us more productive in the work that we do.
And I'm sure governments of all colours would like for this to happen. It's not a particularly political debate whether or not you increase tax receipts from systems. So is there a particular reason why this has been introduced now? Were you not keen to do it under a previous government?
Well, I have to say that regardless of the colour of government, we have often got investment in our compliance work. We are obviously coming in, not just to have a new government now, but we have got a spending review, so this is part of this cyclical process of getting investment in government. But we do get slugs of investment from time to time in fiscal events. HMRC is unusual in that most departments have to wait for a spending review for their investment bids, but because we can bring in additional tax revenues, we often get investment at fiscal event time, and that is something that's quite regular.
Okay, and just lastly on this particular line, 35 million next financial year, how confident are you that you'll be able to reach that? Because relatively few investigations could yield that if you have a good hit rate, as you say, but how confident are you in that 35 million next year?
So I think in terms of being able to spend it to improve our systems, yes, we know what we want to do, and one of the things we'll be doing between now and the money arriving on the 1st of April is making sure that we are mobilised to start spending it as early as possible, so that we are doing the design work and setting up the projects and in defining what it is we want to do with it. So I'm confident that we know how we want to use the investment. Clearly, overall, the budget forecasts that by 29-30 we'll be bringing in almost £6.5 billion additional tax revenues from the total of all of that investment. That is clearly challenging. We've got to be on the ball in terms of using all of the funding that we're being given to make sure that we deliver that.
Okay. And then another line that I wanted to focus on was number 18, increased collection of overdue tax debt by additional investment in HMRC debt management staff. 275 million in 5 months. How are you getting on?
Yes, so we have been given a total of £1.6 billion extra over 5 years to recruit 5,000 additional compliance officers and 1,800 additional debt management officers. 1,500 of those were actually already in post with funding that we had previously been given, but which was due to expire. So this funding allows us to retain those staff, otherwise we would have had to lose them, and then we can recruit a further 300 on top. But that does mean that because there are 1,500 people already in post, we can hit the ground running on the additional debt collection, because they're proficient and trained and already able to operate.
I'll just follow up again on that. Was an announcement made in the budget, so you've only got five months to generate that additional income. Can you give us a sense of how you're getting on towards that one in particular, given that the officers are in place? It's been a month. It's been 1 month at 1 of 5. So
sorry, the additional revenues in what tax year? In what?
24-25?
In 24-25, there's an additional 275 million, if I've read the table correctly, for additional income generated by additional staff on debt management.
Let me help and also slightly correct Jim's numbers. So there are 1,200 staff in debt management who are currently there, who were due to leave at the end of this year, who are now staying. So the reason we're confident about next year's numbers is it's existing people currently in post who will stay in post and carry on doing the work. And then there's a further 600 who will be there by the end of 2027.
This is
which
this
is
year
why
we're
the
talking
number
about.
raises.
This is they'll be in place next year to start. This is 24-25 that Ms Blake is talking about. So
it's 350 million.
Yeah, so those are people
from the Red Book.
Yeah.
They were phasing down towards the end of the year because they were all due to go by the end of the year.
The end of this calendar year or the end of this
financial year. But they are now staying, so therefore we don't need to lose those people.
They were phasing. So you would have lost some of them before the end of the financial year.
Correct.
They were already going, in other words.
Yeah, but then they are now not going, so therefore they are there delivering for us.
That doesn't get to the answer to my question, which was about progress towards that quite significant target of 275 million extra by the end of this calendar year based on those staff. So I understand your explanation that they were going to go, now they don't have to go. But what I'm not clear on is progress towards that significant additional sum after 1 month, given that there are only 4 additional months to meet that target. But perhaps that's something that you can write to us on.
Yeah, we can. In that.
Thank you.
I think I'm making sense in terms of
No,
the
question.
just pushing on this point about additional staff, you talked in April 2024 about having to reduce the size of our customer service group by about 5,000 staff, and how you've talked about the 1,200 that are essentially just safe. So, based on previous cuts to staffing, how quickly can staff be hired now to meet these really quite significant additional income targets?
So if you take the additional 3,000, so it's really the additional staff are for debt collection and for compliance.
Yep.
If you take the 3,000 additional compliance officers that we are due to add to our workforce by the 29/30, we've already got going on that. So the government actually gave us £12 million additional funding in 24/5 in the supplementary estimate, which has enabled us to actually start recruitment now, and the first 200 of those officers joined us this week and have entered their training, and we expect to bring in another 300 by the end of this financial year. So that enables us to sort of get a head start on that.
500 this financial
in this financial year
will lead to the results in 25/26.
Well, yes. So and then we will bring the remainder in slugs over the 5-year period, because we can't take them all in and train them and mentor them at once. It obviously takes time before they are productive, because most of them are entirely new to tax compliance, so they have to go through some basic training before they can be added onto casework, and then it takes some time for that to bear fruit. But together, the debt collection staff and the additional compliance staff we expect will be raising £4.7 billion a year additional revenues by 29/30 as they get trained and become more proficient.
Does this have any impact on time to pay? Are you looking at ratcheting up rates of repayments whether people have a debt? Because time to pay is something you've always talked about as something that's very positive.
Yeah. There are no plans to change our time to pay policy. In fact, one of the things we will want the new debt management officers to do will be to encourage more debtors to get into time to pay arrangements if that's what they need. But our policy remains unchanged.
That means there's a lag in the money coming in potentially. I mean, is there any pressure to do that?
Our experience on time to pay arrangements is that they are a very effective way of managing debt, because they get people who otherwise can't afford to pay their debt into affordable payment arrangements. We've got very high compliance rates with those arrangements. About 90% of them conclude successfully, so they are a very effective way at managing debt in a way which is affordable for the debtor, and also is better for us than taking enforcement action. But certainly there are no plans to change the policy on it at this point.
No increase in the amount threshold. Ms. Bake.
Thank you, Chair. You've talked about ramping up staff and training them in order to generate the additional income that you've anticipated. The additional income is really quite significant, and if this additional income doesn't materialise, we do get close to not meeting fiscal rules. So clearly the role of HMRC is quite significant in terms of delivering on this budget. How did the conversations go between yourselves and Treasury in terms of coming up with this table of income and these measures?
Yeah, so I mean the figures in the table are certified by the Independent Office of Budget Responsibility. Mm-hmm. So we work with them to show them our analysis for what yield we think we can get from the additional funding that we've been given, our plans for spending it, and they then certify that, and they take an estimate that they believe is the correct one to put in the red book. We would hope to do better, but that is, it goes through quite a thorough process. So it is more than a promise from HMRC. It is evidenced to the OBR so that they can sign that off. And I would expect them then, as this period goes on, to monitor whether we are actually implementing what we said we've done. So, for example, that we are actually recruiting and deploying the additional staff that these measures are based on.
So are you able to say what kind of iterative correspondence you had with the OBR in terms of the confidence and risks around these estimates?
So it's a well-worn path for us, because we've had, many, often quite smaller, but many similar investments in previous fiscal events. We know the rate of return that we can get on compliance staff. We know how long it takes us to get new compliance staff trained and proficient. So we've got good evidence that we can show the OBR about how we can implement that and the impact that it will have. Obviously, currently I think the rate of return on our compliance work is about £22 for every pound that we spend. Obviously, if you look at these figures, we're not suggesting that that's the rate of return that we will get on this. It's a lower marginal rate on that, but it is very much in line with what we've done in the past.
Okay, so if these yields aren't generated, will it be the fault of the HMRC?
As far as I'm concerned, we've been given good funding to get on and deliver this yield. It should be achievable, but of course it does mean that we've got to be really effective at implementing this. And so, I wouldn't say it's not easy at all, but it's entirely, as you would expect with something certified with the OBR, entirely achievable. But we have to be on the ball to deliver it.
Okay, just final set of questions really about policy. So this is line 13. And the reason I'm inquiring about this is the relatively small level of income additional yield you've identified in here, which is amending anti-avoidance rules to ensure shareholders cannot extract funds untaxed from closed companies from 30th of October onwards. Expected additional yield 5 million this financial year. Could you talk about your confidence ratings for that one?
Again, all of these lines are certified by the Office of Budget Responsibility. So, we use our data to provide analysis for them about what, how much tax is being lost through a loophole, and therefore what you could expect to gain by closing it, but also what you think the behavioural effects might be, and then they certify the costing for the red book. So this is not an HMRC estimate, this is the OBR's certified costing.
And the costs of implementation are factored in terms of changed policies, additional skills and investigations?
Yes, so in addition to the extra staff that we're getting for compliance work and debt management, the budget as a whole can sometimes involve more costs for HMRC or less costs for HMRC, depending which way the policy change goes. And we monitor all of that and tot it up, and we ask the Treasury to fund all of that as well. So we will actually get funding for staffing which is slightly higher than the additional staffing, because some of it is to implement these measures.
Thank you. Yuan Yang, just on this.
Thank you, Chair. And so, Jim, just to follow on from those questions, you mentioned the really high rate of return from your compliance staff, and my colleagues just raised the line of 5,000 additional compliance staff in this budget. Could one simply keep on going? Would more staff continue that high rate of return, or where do you think that would start to drop? What would be your...
What's your wish? What's your wish list? Here's your chance to bid.
So it's 5,000 additional.
But you got everything you asked for from me.
So we will not have reached break-even point, in the sense that a point where you could not get extra revenue from deploying extra resources in HMRC. So there would still be scope to go further.
Another 5,000?
However, potentially. However, ingesting 5,000 additional staff over that time period is quite significant, because that is 5,000 new recruits on top of the people we would already have been recruiting for attrition. So it's probably over 5 years 12,500 people who will be recruiting and training and mentoring. And obviously you're taking experienced officers away from the front line to do that, so there's an opportunity cost, and it is very important that we are able to really professionalise these people and support them to become proficient. So the first point you reach is actually the department's capacity to do that rather than the capacity of the tax system to give you a return on the investment.
And have we reached that point then with this?
Well, as you would expect, that's something that we are looking at. So this is, from our point of view, very sizable. We have some experience. I think back in 2019 and 2020 we did have a big recruitment, and we did actually see a dip in compliance yield for a period after that because we had to take people away from the front line to mentor them. If you look at these figures, it means that by the end of this Parliament, about 30% of my compliance workforce will either be trainees or relatively newly trained. So that it's a judgment call, really, but certainly we will look as we get experience from bringing the first cohorts on about whether we could do more.
Thank you, Chair.
I mean, in summary, Ms. Yang has kind of touched on it a bit. What's different this time? I've sat opposite you quite often, Sir Jim, on the tax gap over the years, and it's always going to get better, isn't it? Next, what is this a step change, or how can you convince us that this is going to bring in the money that the Red Book tells us it's going to bring in?
I think we've got a very good track record on reducing the tax gap. I mean, sometimes we've been funded to prevent it, to keep it at its existing level. Sometimes we've been given additional funding to reduce it further. It has gone down significantly over the last 20 years, for example, although it's been flatter in recent years. But there is definitely still scope to get more from the tax gap with more resources and more investment in systems as well. And so we've got a high level of confidence that by deploying more compliance resources, you will get more yield.
One of the other things that's happened, as you mentioned, you had a boost in staff a few years ago, and there have been ups and downs. Staff come, then you have a cut in staff, and then you have to recruit again. As you say, it's quite costly because of the expertise that's needed to support those staff. So are you confident with the current arrangements that this will be a steady state approach now?
Yes, so
have you had any guarantees or support?
So if you look at obviously there were other factors in recent years which kind of distort things like the pandemic. But if you look at our performance, we had record compliance yield last year, and last year was really the first year where all of those trainees from earlier on were proficient and were deployed. So I think that's one of the reasons why we had that record yield last year, and I would expect us to achieve a higher yield this year than we did last. So yes, I've got a high level of confidence that we know how to recruit and train and mentor and deploy these people, but the larger the cohort you try to do that with, the more tricky it is.
Point well made. And of course, since I last saw you in committee, you now have a minister chairing the HMRC board. HMRC has always been a non-ministerially led department. Is it now a ministerially led department?
Well, our constitution hasn't changed. So our constitution is set out in the Commissioners of Revenue and Customs Act 2005, and it has always provided for ministers to give us direction, and different ministers have exercised that in different ways, some in more formal governance structures than in others. The Exchequer Secretary James Murray wishes to chair the departmental board, and that is a means by which he can have oversight of us and also and scrutinise what we're doing, but also give us that direction which he is empowered and entitled to do. So it's a new structural approach to it, but it is applying an existing long-standing direction power.
Does it have any impact on your role as Permanent Secretary? Do you feel any difference in relationship with the Minister now that he's chairing the board?
So ministers always have an impact on the Permanent Secretary, but...
you have to say that in front of two former Treasury Ministers.
The Permanent Secretary of HMRC always has to work closely with the Minister to make sure that we understand what the Minister's priorities for us are, and to make sure that our operational policies and strategies are aligned with what the Minister wants, even though the day-to-day running of the department is for the Commissioners, and that is unchanged. But obviously it's a new sort of governance structure that we have to get familiar with, and it's still bedding in.
It's still bedding in, which is, I think, a sort of rather laden comment, if I may say. So, if one of the reasons that ministers didn't have that role partly before was they can't look at individual tax information. Right. Now, I'm sure we've all got great respect for Minister James Murray. I'm sure he wouldn't be trying to interfere. But the point is, the system has now changed. The constitutional position is slightly different, if I put it politely. What's to stop a mad, bad, or dangerous minister saying, Sir Jim, I need to see Meg Hillier's tax return, and how would you deal with that?
First of all, the board has never seen individual taxpayers' affairs or had any decision-making role in them, and that was the case before the Minister became the Chair and remains the case, and the law remains the same, which is that neither I nor any other HMRC official can disclose that information or can give a decision-making right to a minister in relation to an individual taxpayer, and that's completely unchanged, and it is in fact a criminal offence for me or any other officer to do that.
So for you, that's your protection. So that if somebody was trying to push you, where would you have to escalate it to if the minister's the chair? If you'd had a pressure from a politician, so let's say one of us pushed you now to give us evidence, you could presumably take it up through the board and say, I've had this pressure. Where would you take it now? Would you still take it up to the board and the chair of the board?
So it's not. I have to say something that I've experienced, and I'm not sure
I'm heartened to know that.
And I'm not sure how helpful my board or the chair of my board would have been in those circumstances. But yes, I mean, if a minister were to unduly ask to see information or unduly try to make a decision, it's my job as permanent secretary to say you cannot do that. Ultimately, I guess it's a matter for the ministerial code. So if there was persistence, that is, I would go to the Cabinet Office and go to the Cabinet Secretary about that, but it is in practice not something I've experienced.
What you're saying though is, are you saying to us, just to be clear, are you confident that the current arrangements don't change your legal position and responsibilities and have any impact on your judgments?
I can give a categorical assurance it does not change in any way the sort of legal constitution of HMRC, nor in any event does information about individual taxpayers or decisions about individual taxpayers go to the board. That was never the case before, and it's not the case.
Can I just ask, because I think this happened quite quickly after the election, were you aware this was going to happen before the election?
So I can't really discuss what officials...
Sorry, I'm not trying to go into the access talks. I'm just, I don't remember it being in my party's manifesto. Probably was too detailed to be in the manifesto.
Certainly wasn't.
To be honest, I'm not saying it was hidden. But
certainly wasn't in the manifesto.
No.
Not that I'm aware of.
So, Mr.
I just sort of, I really don't understand what difference this makes. If you're operationally independent, the minister chairing the board has no discretion over your day-to-day activities and can't obtain any more information. What additional value does it bring the government other than a superficial presentational one?
So, I mean, my experience so far is that it's not superficial at all. It is the means by which the Exchequer Secretary is exercising his right and power to have oversight of us and to give direction of a general nature to us, which is what the law provides that a minister can do. So that is something that different ministers have done in different ways. So I've had ministers who have done that through a quarterly performance review with the Executive Committee. I've had ministers who've done it in an ad hoc way, just as and when issues have arisen. I've had some ministers who have been quite hands-on and want to do it a lot. I've had other ministers who have said, why are you coming to tell me this? It's your job to run the department. Have been quite hands-off. So there's lots of there is flexibility within the existing legal constitution for the extent to which a minister wishes to exercise that right. But this is just a different governance route for doing that.
I mean, sorry, I don't want to labour the point, but the point is, I sat next to the Financial Secretary when the Financial Secretary was a responsibility for HMRC, and I saw you coming in a number of times quite routinely in that way, so I don't really understand. I'm not saying I have greatest respect genuinely for James Murray, but what I don't understand is what materially is different from those previous very open and real conversations you had with a series of previous FSTs with the new arrangement.
I continue to have that kind of relationship as well, but the Exchequer Secretary has got three key priorities that he wants to see the department deliver on.
There's the tax gap.
And as Ms.
Blake
has,
and I never remember the third. But yeah.
As Ms. Blake has mentioned, within the budget scorecard is a very large amount of revenues riding on the department delivering, and it is his job to oversee us and make sure that
previous ministers would have had a very similar conversation about similar priorities in a just slightly different way and not formalised in this way. Yeah. Okay.
But so from your point of view, there's no constitutional issue. There was no constitutional change that needed to take place for a minister to be told, ask the Chancellor to say you can chair the board. That was all it took, was it?
Yes, there's no need. I mean, the law. The HMRC non-executive board is not a creature of statute at all. Statute really provides two things. One is the commissioners have the day-to-day running of the department, but the other is that ministers can give us general direction. The commissioners
it's very loose. So our loose constitutions allowing this to be. Okay.
The commissioners have long had an arrangement where we've had a non-executive board that scrutinises us and challenges us and advises us. There's just a new chair of that board. Really.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there then for that. Mr. Glenn.
Yes, could we turn to AI and machine learning? Could you just set out for the committee what role you see that's playing within HMRC, and how it facilitates presumably additional tax being obtained through those mechanisms?
So we already have extensive use of what I would call traditional AI, so not the generative AI that is sort of hot topic at the moment, but we've long had extensive use of it, particularly for analytics, to help us to find risks. For example, we've got a lot of repayments go through the VAT system and the self-assessment system, and we use AI to identify what we think are risky repayments before we make them. Similarly, we have used it for analysing vast amounts of data. So, for example, a few years ago when we got the Panama Papers data, that's unstructured data, and we were able to use AI to analyse that and identify risks that then need to be pursued. And we will continue to do that. What is new, obviously, is generative AI, which is AI that's able to produce text or audio or whatever, or images, and we have got some use cases for that, but it is very new and unproven technology. We need to make sure we use it safely and effectively. At the moment, most of our use cases they're really aimed at making our officers more productive rather than dealing directly with the customer. So, for example, in Myrtle's area, we've run a proof of concept to see if generative AI can produce a wrap-up of the helpline call at the end of the call, to see if the helpline operator the task of doing that so they can get on quicker to the next call. We've also rolled out Microsoft Office 365 Copilot to colleagues. If that helps them to be more productive in the production of minutes of meetings or whatever, then they can use that. We are taking part in one customer-facing pilot that the government digital service is running, which is a generative AI chatbot for people setting up a new business to give them sort of government guidance on that, and that is a sort of toe in the water of whether it is going to be safe and effective to use Gen AI for customer-facing guidance. But at the moment, otherwise, we don't do that. In particular, we've got a digital assistant on our gov.uk, which is a sort of chatbot that gives you answers to queries, but that is, in effect, a big FAQ. It's curated answers written by officers. Then it's not generated by AI.
So I play that back to you. I mean, it's essentially a tool for the efficiency of the way your staff work, rather than a customer-facing mechanism or product that you're going to.
At this time, yes. I mean, obviously, we need to make sure that we've got our risk appetite right, and we need to keep that under review because it's a very fast-moving technology. We have obviously. Through the OECD and other forums, checked in with what internationally our colleagues are doing in other tax authorities, and we are in line with them at this stage of the use of this technology. But I think we also need to be ready. There are potentially big prize to be had from Gen AI in terms of much more productive public services. So we need to be ready to change that policy if that is what we need to do. But at the moment, I think our risk appetite doesn't take us there.
So would you be able to quantify the value of AI in terms of sort of reconditioned processes and time saved, or indeed additional tax that you may have been able to raise as a consequence of greater productivity of your staff through the use of AI?
The traditional AI that we've already deployed, we may well have. We certainly looked at that. We may well have quantification. I'd need to check. but the newer applications, we really are at the proof of concept stage for most of it.
I just found as Chief Secretary, AI was used in a ubiquitous fashion in all ministries to sort of basically justify investment to make things more efficient. And it seems to me the quantification of the net effect of AI, and I recognise from the use cases you've described, Sir Jim, that actually there is a meaningful chance that it will be changing. But I think it will be helpful for the committee to substantiate the value of the use cases in order to sort of get behind where its application is valuable. Yeah. Can I just ask you one other question about machine learning? Your report says that it's used. Machine learning is used alongside other controls, and that you've prevented 1.9 billion in revenue loss. Do you think all of that would be attributed to machine learning, or how do you quantify it? Because again, getting back to my core concern that we want to be able to put numbers against investments and justify further use cases.
I will check what more I can tell you about that number. I mean, in practice, it tends to be used in conjunction with officers. So, for example, if you take how we've used AI to analyse bulk unstructured data, that is to find the best cases for an officer then to go away and use. So it sort of improves our productivity, but it's in combination with an officer. We really have got very few instances where it's just all automated, if you like.
The machine learning that's being referenced in that with that 1.9 billion is the risking of repayment. So it's related to what Jim was saying about general risking. Clearly, with VAT in particular, but with other regimes, part of the nature of the regime is people can make claims for repayments. That is an area that can get targeted by people to behave badly. We risk those repayments and have used machine learning to risk those repayments, to try to identify repayments that are wrong, that then an officer looks at to challenge.
I see. I'll just ask one more question. Thank you. Could I direct the question to Ms. Lloyd around the customer service side of things? Obviously, there's a degree of apprehensiveness typically when people encounter HMRC. Sometimes that's totally without foundation. But how do you see AI as enhancing the experience of customers with respect to their interactions with your organisation?
So as Jim had pointed out, we are actively looking at proofs of concept very much in the productivity space. So where the value of Gen AI in that space is for us in the summarization of a call, in the aggregation of our guidance across the patch, in looking at some of our quality assurance processes, and in looking at our complaints handling processes. So in those areas, we see it as a huge way forward. And our colleagues see it as a place where they can, where it's an opportunity for them to focus on the things that the human being can do best on the contact and interaction with the customer themselves. Yeah. So certainly from a colleague perspective, we see it as a huge step forward, as we're seeing from the feedback from the proof of concept we currently have on the Microsoft Copilot.
And the final question is, do you have any conversation with other, I know you're slightly different, but other customer-facing organisations across Whitehall to examine whether you're sort of using AI in similar and best practice ways? I was in the Cabinet Office before the election, and there was always a challenge to make sure that each department was optimising in the best possible way the use of investment in these areas. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have been working with some of the big delivery departments. So I am in touch with my counterparts at the Department for Work and Pensions, at the Ministry of Justice, and in the MOD in particular, and some of the smaller agencies. Right. So we do. So as a community,
you've got a community of interest in this.
We do, as an operational delivery community, we do. But not only that, we also have been interacting and engaging with external organisations, financial services institutions, some of the utilities, to understand how they are using it in their high volume environment and bringing that learning in as well.
Just a quick comment from Bobby Dean, MP.
Yeah, just in your product experimentation with AI, have you considered the role for email as well? I was struck the other day when I got a letter from HMRC, I could only really call a phone number. I appreciate a chatbot might be looked at too, but both those things, phone calls and chatbots, require you to be present for the entire time that you're trying to find out what you're trying to find out. So I know at least one large company, an energy company, has looked at using AI for email. It's been proved effective, so I'd just like to know if you're looking at that too.
That is something that is in our backlog to consider. It isn't the first thing. And email as a channel of communication is probably second in line, because what we would really like to do is have asynchronous sort of secure messaging with our customers, but also encourage people to go into their personal tax accounts or into the app to get the information. So that would be our preferred method for customers to go in and find the information. Email is also a channel, but it's not one that we promote because it's a propensity for phishing and poor practice and bad on the part of poor actors.
Okay, well, there's a lot of cyber security stuff which we can come to. So, thank you. Ewan Yang, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I have some questions about data collection and policy development in HMRC. And the first, looking back to the 1970 Taxes Management Act that was passed, of course, over 50 years ago, what have been the major changes in the tax policy environment since then, and what do you think are the largest shortcomings of that legislation in the present day?
So, Jim, it's like all your Christmases have come early.
Taxes Management Act 1970 is taking me back to my training days. So, so that is the framework within which we administer tax. So I mean, they're not completely distinct, but there are two distinct things for me. One is tax policy, which really is setting who should pay tax and how much they should pay and what reliefs and exemptions you should have. And then the other is the tax administration framework, which is the powers and the safeguards for us as we administer the tax system. And that's really what the Taxes Management Act 1970 contained. And that has obviously been changed very considerably over the years as we have implemented different ways of administering the tax system. I mean, the constant I think the constant challenge is making sure that we have got effective powers so that we are able to keep up with how the world is changing and able to intervene when necessary, but also make sure that you've got effective safeguards for taxpayers so that they can have confidence that we're using those powers responsibly and that they have got a right to challenge if we're not doing so. And the nature of tax policy making is it accretes and accretes and accretes and becomes a very large body of law. But we do periodically have sort of pretty fundamental reviews of our powers and safeguards and go back to basics and make sure that they are kept up to date. But yes, it has changed significantly. I mean, one of the biggest changes obviously was moving to the system whereby it's really the responsibility of the personal taxpayer to assess themselves what their liability is rather than HMRC, and that was the self-assessment system that was introduced about 25 years ago. But it just needs to be constantly kept under review.
You talk about having the challenge of having effective powers. And my understanding is that you have the Management Act gives you the power to collect information relating to the enforcement of the current tax system, but not information that would help inform the future changes in the tax system. And that might explain, for example, some of my colleagues' questions around provision of data on farm ownership, also the lack of information about the offshore income gains of non-DOMs, which previously was not taxed but is now about to be taxed. What would you say to the criticism that HMRC needs more powers in order to have more forward-looking data for policy evaluation and development?
Yeah, so there has been some review of this recently, particularly since the pandemic, where so the general rule is I can only collect the data that I need to administer the tax system.
According to law.
And yes, and obviously that's about making sure that I don't take upon myself more powers than I need, but it's also about managing the just the administrative burden on people who have to provide that data. But we have then encountered situations where that means we haven't got the data that we would have liked to have to, it might be to analyse new policy, but in the case of the pandemic, it was to help people who needed help. So there has been some review after that about whether we should gather more data than we currently do so that we are well placed to deal with contingencies if they happen. There is some more that we are collecting. So, for example, I believe we are going to collect data about dividends received by shareholders of sort of owner-managed companies, because one of the criticisms during the pandemic was that we were unable to identify those people and direct help to them. But it is a balancing act between making sure we're able to respond to those contingencies and minimising the burden on people of giving data that might not be used.
And after that review, was there a change to the way that you can proactively identify future data needs, or is it simply on a case-by-case basis? How is that now managed?
I mean, I think the outcome of that review in the end up was a fairly modest increase in our data collection powers. I think one of the issues is not just what data we receive, but when we get it. So if you take employment taxes, we have pretty much real-time information about people. So every time an employer runs their payroll, we get that payroll data. But self-employed people, we are often getting data much, a long way down the line, and that can affect our ability to administer the tax system effectively. One area in recent years where there's been a lot of error and fraud is in research and development relief, and one of the challenges there for us has been, one, that there was quite limited amount of data that people had to give us with their claim, but also that the claim could be made some very considerable time after the R&D had taken place, and so getting more real-time data as well as sort of more data can be quite useful.
And kind of legally speaking, to be able to have the power to collect the kind of data you were speaking about in real time, and any more proactive data you might need over the course of the next Parliament, is that a change that needs to be made in law, or is that simply a kind of agreement with the ministers?
By and large, it has to be legislative. I mean, if we need data to administer existing taxes, then sometimes there is a provision in law that says such information as the commissioners may prescribe. So we can do that really in a secondary or tertiary way. But if you're talking about us gathering data that we don't currently need to administer the tax system, that would require legislation.
And you talk about the timeline of getting the data in, and of course, we all know how time pressured the budget cycle can be. Do you ever receive policy suggestions which you feel you can't cost or develop fully in the timeline of one budget cycle? And if so, what happens to those suggestions? Is there an agenda for working on them practically in future rounds?
So certainly the budget process with ministers involves us giving advice on the operational capability to deliver policies, and ministers will then make their trade-offs about when they want to introduce something versus what it is we can do. So some policies, ministers will decide, well, we're going to take some considerable time to introduce that, to give you time to, and others time to prepare. Others, ministers will say, well, we want to introduce this policy really quickly and we're prepared to take some rough edges on its implementation because the priority is getting it into place fast, and that's.
And they have to backtrack.
Sorry, and that is, that's part of my job is to advise on those options, and but the choices obviously are for ministers to make.
Do you ever get timed out by that process? As in, there are policies that are suggested, but because of the lack of data that you have, you can't really do anything about it in the time span. And then
if ministers wanted to make major radical reform to the tax system, that is the work of several years or maybe even more than one parliament, then yes, we would sit down and advise them about how in a phased way you could move towards your objective.
Okay. Mr. Glenn picked up on AI, but surely there's a possibility here that AI could be used to pull data that you've already got. I don't know what legislation you would need for that. So we've talked about farms, we talked about before COVID, so self-employed people. Pulling that data together through collecting it through AI, would that be legal, or would you have to have a change in the law for AI to do that if it was a temporary thing, for instance, just to provide advice or indeed to provide a solution as in COVID.
You're testing my knowledge of data protection law, which is not my... I mean, obviously, if there is publicly available data, then yes, we can use our analytical power to try and bring it together and use that to
AI
advise
could
on
potentially
policy.
be positive in that
Could
respect. So, for
potentially help.
instance, the farms thing, I mean, there must be other data around that could have been aggregated if you've got the right artificial intelligence program.
It can certainly help with analytics, data analytics, particularly if you've got large quantities of unstructured data. But obviously, you know, data protection laws also limit who can access what data, so we may need legislative cover depending on the nature of the data.
I think Ms Rigby wanted to just pitch in on this.
Yes, if I might, Sir Jim, I wanted to follow up actually in relation to AI, like the chair. You mentioned other jurisdictions that use AI, and I can't recall if you meant Gen AI in that context. But I guess two things. First, are there any jurisdictions that you think are particularly good at the moment that we might be able to emulate in certain ways? And secondly, following on from that, I suppose, are the programs that are being used elsewhere that you think are good but they wouldn't work for our circumstances, or you've adjudged them to be too risky?
We engage with lots of other tax authorities, mainly through the Forum of Tax Administrations of the OECD. You've obviously got comparable places like Australia is a good example because they've got a relatively similar tax system to ours, and the ATO are people that we work with closely and learn from. In terms of, if you said which tax authorities kind of have got the more advanced use of data, I mean, it tends to be Scandinavian countries. They are able to pre-populate people's tax files with lots of data, but they have got a whole culture goes quite beyond the tax system of the state gathering data and being able to match it to citizens that so it's not something would be within the gift of HMRC, but they tend to have much more automated digital tax systems than we have. When it comes to the application of, say, Gen AI, I'm comfortable that having engaged with my colleagues in other tax authorities, they're all taking a very similar approach to us. And indeed, I met the Singaporeans, for example, 2 weeks ago, who are regarded sort of at the front edge of this, and they are taking a very similar approach to us, which is there must be lots of potential in this, but it is an emerging technology and there are lots of risks around it as well, and therefore they are focusing at this stage on internal use cases that improve the productivity of their officers rather than use cases that involve Gen AI producing answers for our decisions for taxpayers.
So would it be fair to say that you're actively on the lookout for new use cases? Is that fair?
Yes, and we liaise closely with the Central Data and Digital Office and the Government Digital Service in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, whose job it is to coordinate across government. And one of the things that we do there is sort of assess our risk appetite against other departments to make sure that it's in line, but also understand what they are doing so that we can learn from them and not duplicate. And the UK is frankly very well placed on AI. Where most of my colleagues see us as well advanced and learn from us about as much as we learn from them. But it's interesting to see where people are setting their risk appetite at this point.
Can I just add on one risk? There was one case where someone had put in an appeal to an HMRC tax bill, attaching, I think it was 12 previous precedent cases, all of which were not real. And it's entirely possible that the correspondent didn't know because they'd done it through ChatGPT or whatever. Are you getting many like that? And what's the impact on HMRC's resources and how to check?
Yes, so that wasn't directly to HMRC. So a taxpayer went to the tribunal and put in their arguments, and they quoted some decided cases, and when we searched for them we couldn't find them, and it turned out ChatGPT or something similar had just invented them, really. And that is one of the risks with this is that it will hallucinate and invent things. And it's one of the reasons why you have to step carefully.
How you getting many like that, many situations like that?
No, I mean that one was. I mean, I'm not aware that there've been any more. That one obviously got reported because it was so unusual. I think luckily for them, they were an unrepresented appellant. I suspect if it had been a lawyer, the judge might have been less understanding. But but it was an example of why we have to step carefully. I think if you control the data that the Gen AI uses, then you are less likely to get that kind of response. But this is I mentioned earlier, we are dipping our toe in the water with one use case that we're working on GDS on, and that is something that we will be testing as part of that.
All right, Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I know colleagues will have a lot more questions on making tax digital and so on, but I just wanted to go back to the questions the Chair had about the Minister on the HMRC board and revisit that saga that we had earlier this year when HMRC turned off the helpline, and then my understanding it was probably the Chancellor at the time overruled that.
And so we're talking about last summer, aren't we? Summer 23.
When was it exactly?
Summer 23.
Was it earlier this year?
Sorry, March.
I think we've had two
instances
instances of it, and I just wondered if you could share with us how you think having a minister on the board is going to affect a decision like that, which you clearly took sort of operationally independently, but ministers didn't feel comfortable with.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with your assessment of how that happened. So first of all, I think there were two things. We did pilot temporarily closing helplines in 2023, and then we announced that in March of this year we intended to close the self-assessment helpline for the summer months, and that we would make that a permanent part of our cycle, and that was withdrawn almost immediately. But it goes back to what Mr. Glenn said earlier. We do liaise with our ministers. That is not the kind of decision that the Commissioners for Revenue and Customs would take without consulting with our minister, because that is a kind of area where a minister can give you a direction of a general nature and can say, yes, I'm happy for you to go ahead and do that, or no, that's not what I want you to do. At that point, with no minister chairing the board, the mechanism would have been, as Mr. Glenn described, which was to go and see the minister and say, this is the one way that we could do this. Now, that is potentially the type of thing that we would take to the board and say that we are considering, but it's still ultimately for the minister to make the call. The
minister could have overruled that before it happened last time. Yeah. And obviously a key part of your goal, which I think is still your strategic plan, is to move people much more onto online interactions, is the app. And I think you shared with us some statistics earlier this year about the take-up of the app. The app seems to be quite a sort of consumer-friendly type of app. I think I follow these things relatively closely. I had no idea it existed until that whole saga with the helpline. And so I do now actually have the app downloaded, and I don't know whether all my colleagues do yet.
There's a next bit of homework for the
committee. Could you tell us how the app downloading take-up is going?
Okay, so so last year there were just under 4 million users, I think 3.8 million users. It was used 88.5 million times by those people. That was a 64% increase on the previous year, and we are seeing rapid growth.
How many people have downloaded it now?
I don't have an up-to-date figure. We're in the middle of a campaign to promote it to, I think, 18 to 34-year-olds.
How are you doing the campaign?
That is, it's on television, it's on social media, it's on both paid and unpaid media, and they are a key target group. First of all, because they are familiar with using apps, but also for example, Myrtle at the moment is getting a lot of phone calls from students who've got a Christmas job and are ringing up saying, I need my national insurance number. That's quite frustrating, because if they had the app, it has got their national insurance number readily available. So we're really focusing on them at the moment, and we want to increase its usage. What we are finding with customers using our digital services is, even if they're not using the app, they want to use a mobile device increasingly. So if you go onto our app, for example, to do your self-assessment tax return, you can do it on there. It will seamlessly bring you through to gov.uk to complete that, and you can do all of that on your mobile phone. It's sized for the screen and everything. And so it is the fastest growing part of our digital services, and I think we reached a point recently where it kind of tipped over as the main way that customers...
Well, I think what the committee would love to know is your strategic plan in terms of how you expect take-up to evolve, what your numbers are today, and then we can sort of keep holding you accountable on that front.
We can certainly look to do that. I mean, our Minister has committed that in the spring we are going to publish a digital services roadmap, which is setting out how we intend to implement our digital first strategy.
You must already have an idea
Yes,
of where,
yes, we do.
And what the numbers are now,
yes,
and what's in your plan. So
it's well over 4 million users.
We don't have to wait till next year's roadmap to sort of get some data out of you, I don't think.
Yeah.
And then if I may, just sort of turning to another aspect of online, the sale of goods online, like through Vinted and so on, that we discussed, I think, at the committee in the previous Parliament, where it was inadvertently threatening to capture very, very small sellers in online marketplaces. And then similarly, for the situation where you have someone who's selling something in the UK who's pretending to be a UK business, because you, on online marketplaces, you will treat the non-UK businesses differently from UK businesses. Can you give us an update on where HMRC is on those slightly grey areas that come about of the fact that we're all buying more online?
Yes, so I think there are two different issues there, if I can separate them. So first of all, new rules have been introduced requiring online marketplaces to share data with HMRC about sales online. That does not in any way change the underlying rules about whether people are taxable or not. It is simply about giving us more data, and that was a sort of, I think some stories ran away with that, and it was an interesting sort of experience for us in terms of use of social media, because it was TikTok where it all kind of took off about that this is a change in the tax rules, and it is not at all. So the tax rules about whether someone has to pay tax if they sell things online are unchanged. Generally speaking, if you are selling clothes that you no longer wear, or your children's clothes that they've grown out of, or books that you've read you don't want anymore, there's no question of you having to pay tax on that. But if you sell goods for resale, or if you buy goods for resale at a profit, or if you're making things to sell for a profit, then yes, you'll be taxable on that, whether you sell them online or sell them on a market stall or whatever. What we now get is better data from the online marketplaces about people who are selling, and there was a financial limit put in on if sales above a certain level, that's when it triggered the requirement for the online marketplace to give us that data, and we will obviously use that to identify anyone who might not be declaring income that they should be declaring, or might be under declaring it. But it's not a decision-making tool, it's simply helping with our risk assessment. The second point is about collecting VAT from sellers, particularly foreign sellers who are selling to UK residents.
It's more the fraud that's being committed, where people are pretending to be UK-based sellers. Yeah.
So the rule is that if it's a foreign seller using an online marketplace, then the online marketplace has to account for the VAT. If they are a UK seller, then the online marketplace does not. That obviously creates the risk that a foreign seller will try to masquerade as being established in the UK.
The National Audit Office says there's lots of that happening.
Well, it is a risk. We don't believe that it is that is the case. We have
saying the National Audit Office is wrong.
They're wrong.
Sorry. Well, I mean, they will have their view. I mean, it is just one of many compliance risks that we have to manage. We have given guidance to the online marketplaces about what they need to do in terms of due diligence to identify the place of establishment of a business and make sure that it is in the UK, so that they don't have to account for VAT. And we will keep that risk under review.
They're telling you there's wholesale fraud going on, aren't they?
Well, I mean, what we've seen as a result of the introduction of these online marketplace rules is a significant reduction in the non-compliance and a significant increase in VAT compliance. It is not perfect, and we'll keep it under review, and we will, advise on ministers on changing the law, or we will change our sort of operational response if necessary. But what we have seen is a very significant improvement in VAT compliance. That is one particular risk because of a boundary in the legislation that we have to manage, but we feel that we've given good guidance to the online marketplaces. We work very closely with them on their processes to make sure that they're applying them effectively, and if they do that, we believe they should be able to identify cases where the company is not established in the UK and therefore they should be paying tax.
Sounds like fertile ground for the area that Rachel Blake MP was asking about, and I think you've got some further questions as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Bobby Dean.
Yeah.
Yes, we've talked quite a bit about sort of digital capabilities already, but I want to move on to Making Tax Digital, a service that's been around for some time but still being rolled out, and I think we read in some of your documentation that you want to roll out to income tax from 2026. Could you just give us a review of where you think you're at with it, if there's been any concerns that you've spotted so far, and are you happy with the pace of the rollout?
So we've already implemented Making Tax Digital for VAT, and that has, I think, proved effective. We are getting lots of feedback from VAT payers that they are finding it easy to comply with. We obviously have already processed millions of VAT returns through it, and we have evidence that it is reducing error in VAT compared with the pre-MTD days, because it requires the taxpayer to maintain their records using business accounting software that speaks to our systems, and therefore reduces the risk that they're not keeping contemporaneous records, or they're losing receipts, for example, or that they're making errors as they're transcribing from their systems into the VAT return. The next phase is MTD for income tax, which we've got a small number of users in a private beta testing at the moment, but is mandated for the first cohort of people from April 2026, and that is later than we would have liked. But is well on track to deliver for then. A second cohort then comes on in 2027, and the government has recently announced that they intend to bring a third cohort on before the end of this Parliament.
What is the reason for it being phased over such a long time? I appreciate the need to get things right, and you are doing tests to make sure of that, but why can't that happen at a much bigger pace?
So I think the challenge of implementing it for income tax is much greater than it was for VAT. It's a different population of taxpayers, and certainly the third cohort, for example, to come on are people with much lower levels of turnover, and so they were not already in the VAT system, not used to making quarterly filings with us. So it is I think a bigger challenge for those people. So we are, one of the changes that we made to assure delivery of it was that we will bite this off in chunks. Okay. But obviously it does reduce the tax gap, so the faster we can implement it, the better, but you've got to balance that with making sure it's effectively landed.
Yeah, and my final question just relates to that actually, which is obviously there's still scope for human error. There's still human beings inputting stuff into the software. So just how transformational has it been so far? Has it provided you with marginal gains, or have they been substantial? How would you describe?
So it bites a bit off the tax gap, but it does not solve the small business tax gap. It is very much focused on reducing error as opposed to deliberate evasion, for example. But it does contribute something off the small business tax gap, and it is substantial in terms of amounts of additional revenues that are on the government scorecard as a result. And whilst we haven't quantified it, I would expect that this extra cohort, that when it's announced when they're going to come on, that will similarly reduce the tax gap more. But it's not a magic bullet to the small business tax gap.
Yes, on Monday, Pat McFadden, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, made a speech talking about the risks around cyber attacks. And we've seen, for example, Transport for London has had some challenges. Given the emphasis, growing emphasis that you're placing on sort of digitisation of services, how well equipped do you think the HMRC is to deal with that ever more sophisticated range of threats from hostile actors?
So we are an attractive target for cyber attacks, and we are constantly attacked, and it's an arms race, really. So we cannot rest. We have obviously got legacy IT, so we've got some challenges in HMRC that some of our technology is not the most up to date and therefore can contain vulnerabilities, and so we're constantly looking at how we can use the investment that we get, not just to deliver the benefits that are on the budget scorecard or deliver cost savings, but also to make our IT estate more resilient. And we have made some improvements. For example, over the last 18 months, we have a dashboard that tracks the security and reliability and resilience of our systems, and we have a score for what we think our score is, and we have a target for what we want to attain, and we track that we are making progress against that all the time. I would like to make more progress, because we are carrying more risk than I would like, but nevertheless, it's a never-ending battle. I'm not aware that we've had any cyber attack that's been successful in defrauding us. The attacks to try and defraud us tend to be non-cyber, so they involve fraudsters persuading our customers to give them their data, often unwittingly. So you'll get a phishing attack that appears to come from HMRC, you will give them the data, they will then try to use that to get into our systems. And that's not really a cyber attack on HMRC, it's just breaking through.
It is still what you call the old-fashioned.
It's just breaking through our ID&V checks. So we haven't had a successful cyber attack that has caused the kind of disruption that you've seen in the NHS or the British Library or TfL, but we are. We have vulnerabilities, and we are a big target. So.
Thank you. Lucy Rigby MP.
Thank you, Chair. So, Jim, I just want to pick up on the point that Dame Harriet was making about the loophole when it comes to platforms and foreign sellers masquerading as domestic sellers. You clearly don't think the amount tax lost, I think, is as big as the NAO, but do you have a ballpark figure for it, or might you be able to let us know?
No. I mean, I'll take that away. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not a problem that we don't need to be on, and indeed we are. I think the point I was trying to make is we have made very significant headway from the days when the chair was waving things that she'd bought online without having to pay VAT in reducing the loss of VAT from online sales. It is not perfect and probably never will be, but but we have. In a sense, we've got some more residual issues to deal with than in those days.
Understood. And the chair may bring out some things that she...
We know now you're tempting us to another mystery shop.
Disappointed if you produce.
You're going to have a dozen people now more on the app, so I'll get that 4 million whenever up. Thanks to Dame Harriet. Just before we go back to Ms. Rigby, I just wanted to pick up on the online. We have a trust now about online to a degree. Okay, you do your tax return, a lot of the online digital. People trust that the population of data will be correct. I mean, it's come across my desk that some for the child benefit tax charge. There's maybe it's worth you having a look at the glitch in the system, that it rates the repayment at the rate of this year's child benefit, not at the year in the tax year concerned, which is, on my calculation, a £72 difference that taxpayers are having to pay in their tax return from last year. So if you've got £96 for one child instead of 102, I think it is this year, that you're being charged at the 102 rate for last year. I wonder if that's something you're aware of, or you could have a look at.
Not something I'm aware of, or my colleagues aware of.
Okay, no. So maybe I'll find some information and write to you on that. But if the problem is, my point is, if there's a bit of the system that goes wrong and people start losing trust in it, do you have any data, Ms. Lloyd, about whether customers trust the system when they are going digitally, and sort of customer satisfaction?
So we do. We measure customer satisfaction and net easy scores. I think that in terms of whether we have a trust score, not as such. We do trust surveys, I think, on HMRC as a whole on a regular basis. But I think that there is some work for us to do in reassuring customers, because if I look at the contact that I get, quite a big proportion of it is people do stuff and then they call us to seek reassurance. So I think there is work to be done over there, but we don't have a specific trust measure.
It was quite complex. I had a constituent only the other day raise with me concern. She's now gone only pay AYE because of challenges getting things right on her tax return, and it wasn't down to her very well. In fact, she was owed money by HMRC, and then it became very complicated, and she found it so much headache making, even though she in the end got an accountant at some expense for her to do it. So she stopped wanting to engage with HMRC except through pay AY, which seems to be a limit on people's employment or prospects and entrepreneurial spirit, if that's the case. But anyway, perhaps I'll raise that with you separately. I think I might be writing to you anyway. Ms. Rigby, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And so Jim, I wanted to pick up on the phone lines, which Dame Harriet again mentioned earlier. You announced last year that you were going to close them, and you then reversed that decision. And I think you told the committee last time you were here that you were talking to ministers about that. Can you update us on the status of those discussions?
There are currently no plans to close our helplines. They're all open, and that is the plan. We were given additional funding this year to enable us to, to compensate for the sort of service impact of not closing the helpline. So we got an additional £51 million in the supplementary estimate, which Myrtle has used to deploy additional helpline advisors, and as a result of which we expect that we will actually hit our service standards in the second half of this year on the helplines. It is nevertheless the case that we have been reducing the telephony contact from customers and through greater take-up of digital services. We know that there is both customer appetite to do more digitally, and from our analysis of our phone calls that we are getting avoidable contact that could be handled digitally. So we will want to keep on a path of reducing that contact and increasing digital self-service, but there are no plans at the moment to close any helplines.
Thank you. And can you tell us a little bit about the metrics that you're using for the purposes of assessing those phone calls?
So we use a couple. So the two customer satisfaction and net easy. So the customer satisfaction measures how satisfied the customer are with their service and with the outcome. Net easy is how easy it was for them to access our services. We also look at the average agent handle, and that's the percentage of calls that come through to an agent, and our target is 85% agent handled. But behind it, it also gives us, we understand how long people are waiting to get through to an agent, and we measure our web chat availability as well.
Okay, thank you. But and you feel in relation to, you mentioned, Sir Jim, the extra money going in, so is it right to say on those metrics that things are looking better, things are improving? Is that fair? Yeah. So we were well below our advisor attempts handled target last year and in the first quarter of this year. But with the additional funding that we were given, that has been on an improving path throughout the summer. And from the 1st of October, we've been hitting our service standards, and we expect to be able to do so for the remainder of this year. And we also believe with the funding we've been given for 25-26 that we should be able to hit those service standards next year as well. But they do depend on us continuing to drive down contact demand as we have been doing in recent years. So it's not a it doesn't enable us or involve us reversing our strategy of digital first. Yes, and that's a very helpful segue, actually, if I might say so, what I wanted to ask about next, which is the digital transformation roadmap. You're preparing for that at the moment, is that right?
Yes, we've a long track record of implementing digitalisation. So, for example, almost all self-assessment returns are filed online. Virtually all employer pay-as-you-earn, VAT, corporation tax, that's all filed online. What we're really focusing on now is the contact from personal tax payers. So on pay-as-you-earn, for example, this year we've already made progress. So in particular, we've introduced significant system improvements to pay-as-you-earn coding, which is reducing the number of calls that we are receiving as a result, because pay-as-you-earn calls represent 41% of all the calls that we receive. We've also, in 2023, completely digitised child benefit. So a service which prior to May 2023 was almost wholly paper-based is now almost entirely digital. The vast majority of claims are made digital, and we've got a long sort of backlog of changes that with investment we can continue making. We know that roughly 2/3 of the calls that we receive are calls that we believe could be done. The customer could self-serve basically, and that would free up Myrtle's advisors to focus on those customers who really need to speak to a human being because they've got, they may have personal or health circumstances that mean they're not capable of doing things digitally, or they may just have a complex matter that needs to be dealt with by an officer, and we want to be able to reach those people by encouraging others to self-serve online.
Yeah, I think there are a fair number of people, obviously, that are digitally excluded at the moment, and a number of people, I'm sure, who would feel slightly uneasy about the push towards digital because they much prefer doing things in a non-digital way. So, what would your message to them? Would your message to them be, don't worry, because there's always going to be an option to be able to do things differently over the phone and via paper?
So I think we are always going to encourage anyone who can do it online and whose issue is capable of being dealt with online to try that first. And there will be a web chat advisor, for example, at the end of your digital journey if you find that you can't. So we definitely want to encourage people. Your first option should not be to lift the phone. Your first option should be to go online and try that if you can. But if you know that you can't, yes, our advisors are there to help you. And the more we can manage down the avoidable contact, the quicker we can get to those people. We have done some customer research, and that showed that 86% of our customers are willing to deal with us digitally, but that number drops off quite significantly once complexity comes into it, or if they encounter a problem. So the smoother we can make it for people, the better. And also, there's also quite a need from our customers for reassurance. So one of the things we learned with Child Benefit, for example, is whilst we now have an end-to-end digital service, a lot of customers would then ring us to progress chase straight away. We now use SMS messages to people who have filed a child benefit claim online to say, don't worry, we have your claim, don't worry, we will get to it. And that, again, reduces avoidable contact.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to talk about minimum wage enforcement, and you do name and shame some companies. I see B&Q and EasyJet. What's the process for deciding who to name and shame, and how does that fit in with your overall enforcement strategy?
So HMRC does not name employers, so that is done by the Department for Business and Trade. So we enforce the national minimum wage on behalf of the Department of Business and Trade. We refer to them what we find, and then they decide who to name. But they have a general principle that they will name employers who have breached national minimum wage law.
All employers or certain employers?
I don't think it's 100%, so DBT, but you would need to speak to the Department for Business and Trade. I'm afraid we don't make the decision in HMRC.
Do you find it easier to assess enforcement in large companies as opposed to small ones?
It's easier, obviously. You have a bigger impact. Large employers, you are reaching many more employees per employer. But we want to make sure we look into any complaint from anyone that they are not receiving the national minimum wage. We've got 100% review of those. We also then proactively risk assess ourselves and add cases for investigation based on our risk assessment. I think any employer that pays very close to the national minimum wage, they are high risk, because if they then start making deductions from those, or if they don't pay for people's training time, whatever, they can easily find themselves falling foul of the law. So we've got our own risk assessment approach for that.
That'd be good. So do you have a risk assessment in particular in regards to the social care sector? We don't sort of pick on a sector, but if the employment practices in that sector throw up risks, for example, because of the level of pay or because of the practices they have. For example, if that is a sector that expects people to pay for their uniforms, for example, and they're paying very close to the national minimum wage, then they could fall on the wrong side as a result. So that is a risk factor that we would take into account in selecting cases. But in addition, any care worker who feels they're not receiving the national minimum wage, they can contact us or ACAS, and we will always look into their complaint. I suppose the individual care worker might be an issue in that their minimum wage, there's 10% vacancy rates, about a third turnover every single year, so they're coming into a sector where they're not being paid the minimum wage. They might leave quite quickly. The Low Pay Commission found in 2023 that non-compliance was rife in the sector. The Nuffield Foundation has found similar. The Resolution Foundation finds that 23% of care workers aren't being paid what they're owed. So the question I'm trying to get at is, what is HMRC doing about that?
So we actively tackle national minimum wage non-compliance. we have collected millions of pounds on behalf of people who have not been paid their wages and made sure that they got the money that they are entitled to. And we sort of do that without fear and favour. We obviously try to cover where the risks are, and we also respond to any complaint, which people can make anonymously, or they can be named if they wish.
And given this new government is planning to bring in a social care service, have you had any meetings, with the DHSC to see how you could help enforce a higher, or rather enforce the current minimum wage in the sector to help improve retention and the care that we all receive?
I don't know if we've had any dealings with the DHSC. I mean, obviously we enforce this policy on behalf of the Department for Business and Trade. It's their policy, and we certainly liaise a lot with them to make sure that we are, meeting their needs.
Okay, that's right. And I'd like to move on to something slightly different now, if that's okay. Move on to Brexit border, or rather checks of implementation. We thought that implementation of import requirements was going to happen in 2022. I think in October this year, we're talking about staying for another 3 months until January the 1st, 2025, until Brexit border checks are kind of implemented on goods coming into the UK. Why the delay?
As far as the customs responsibilities that HMRC is responsible for, they have now all been implemented, with the exception of safety and security declarations that are coming in on 31st of January 2025. So we now have full import and export controls from a customs point of view for GB EU movements, and that's been done in 2 stages. First of all, EU with the exception of Ireland, and then Ireland, and then the final thing to sort of brick in the wall on the 31st of January is safety and security declarations. So there are no outstanding controls that HMRC is responsible for.
You are ready for 31st of January 2025?
Yes, we agreed to slightly delay the implementation of that because we were unable to do some things during the pre-election period, and we concluded that traders would need a little bit of extra time. So I think it was extended by 6 months to the 31st of January.
Do you think traders are now ready?
Yes, I think that we've got a high expectation. Our experience of the previous controls that we've introduced is that there's a high level of compliance with them, and we're confident that we've supported traders to be ready for safety and security declarations as well. Customs is a highly intermediated market, so there are lots of customs intermediaries out there, and lots of sort of software products that help traders. So there's a ready industry, support industry, if you like, to help traders to do what they need to do.
That's great to hear. Thank you very much, Sir Jim. Chair.
Yeah, one of the things that often gets raised with us is people are having something delivered. There's a tax charge on it that haven't expected, so the consumer, maybe traders, you say maybe already, not sure that they'd all agree, but for consumers who then think, well, I'm not going to pay that much money for this parcel, I wasn't expecting it. Is this causing a problem in your system at all, or is it something that you think is someone else's problem, and are you aware of the scale of that challenge?
Yes, we certainly get. I certainly see quite a bit of correspondence from people who've ordered things. It's perhaps not always transparent to them when they order things online that it is going to come to them from abroad, for example, and that therefore there could be a tax charge that they will have to pay when they receive it. The couriers are responsible for making sure that that is complied with, but I think there is the market needs to make sure that it's got the right transparency for consumers, so that when they're ordering things, they've got an awareness of what is going to happen. I think.
So your role for HMRC there, when you were talking earlier about the channels that you advertise to your 18 to 34-year-olds about the app, you talk about how the scare stories around sales of your clothes on Vinted went around very quickly on TikTok. Do you think you've got a role, one, to warn people about the charges that may come in because they're not being maybe as ready as traders, and 2, are you using all the right social media apps? Which ones are you using to advertise to the people who might otherwise not be aware?
I think that's a good question. We tend to deal with the people who have got the liability, which in this case is the couriers, and make sure that they are complying with their obligations. But I'm sure for them it is unwelcome when customers challenge and say they weren't aware these things were going to happen. So I will look at what we do to raise consumer awareness. But it's definitely the case. I do see cases.
And which channels do you use maybe Ms. Lloyd can answer, but if young people are on TikTok, finding out about scare stories about selling their clothes on Vinted? Are you using those sorts of channels to advise people, everything from the app to the deadline for their tax return?
Guest experience for you.
I personally don't, but I should have brought my head of comms. We certainly have a very...
Become a new hit, Sir Jim, the tax man on TikTok.
We do have a very active presence on social media, and because it is a relatively low-cost way of reaching people, so we do use it heavily. Yeah.
Are you allowed to use TikTok as a government department?
I'm not sure we do actually. I'm not aware that we do.
Ministers are not allowed to now, so I don't know.
I'm not aware that we do.
Thank you, John Glenn, MP. Yeah. Oh no. Yes. I was just actually going to ask quickly about fraud, COVID, age-old COVID. Obviously, there were a number of fraudulent claims. They weren't in your accounts, so specific mention of COVID in their accounts, and there is there will be a number of fraudulent claims that have not yet been written off. What are you going to do about them? Are you going to be writing them off in next year's accounts?
No, we've got no plans to write off pursuing COVID fraud. So if you recall, our estimate of the total fraud in the COVID schemes that we were responsible for was about £5 billion, which is about 5.1% of the total value of the schemes. We have so far recovered over a quarter of that. Whilst we have stood down this specific task force that was looking at it, we continue to look at it as a risk.
Are you getting? I mean, because like furlough fraud, we've discussed. You and I have discussed, not this committee, but we've discussed it with the predecessor committee. It's very hard to track down. At what point are you going to write off fraud? Well, if I were to give you an example of furlough fraud now, would you still would you still find it cost effective to pursue it? Mr. Holliday's nodding.
Yes, we would pursue it. I mean, at the moment, one of the reasons why we obviously stood down the task force was that we were starting to see diminishing returns, and we could get better returns from that resource on other things. But we still actively pursue furlough scheme furlough fraud. In fact, there's a trial underway in Birmingham right now on people who are being.
The government's got a COVID fraud czar now. Is that anything to do with you? Do you work with them? Will you be working with them when they're? Well, Mr. Glenn might find out if they've been appointed yet.
Yes, we are within their ambit.
Okay.
I think there's some sort of misunderstanding, because it was my recollection that after COVID, additional resources were made available, 100 million, so that you could pursue sort of fraud cases, and then you've got this 1.16 billion out of the circa 5 billion you estimated that was fraud. Where does this law of, you will obviously, as you dutifully have throughout your distinguished career, do whatever government asks you to do, but there is a professional judgment, surely, about a law of diminishing returns. Now, the government is going to have this COVID fraud commissioner. How does that interact with your professional judgment of the sort of tail of the, I assume, 3.5 billion, less 3% or less of the the lost money, when we always knew from the input from the assessment made when you were doing all that work in the first quarter of 2020 that there was always a risk associated with this?
Yes, and obviously we used our professional judgment when we decided to close down the task force, because we did not feel it was the best value for money use of that resource.
So why now we've got a COVID fraud commissioner, which runs counter to, in essence, to that professional judgment really around shutting it down because there was a law of diminishing returns. That's why we stopped doing it in the previous government, right?
So the commissioner obviously is looking much more widely than the schemes that HMRC was responsible for, and indeed I wouldn't expect them to be at the core of what the commissioner is looking at, but they are within their ambit. My view is, particularly for fraud, we are never going to give up and say we're not going to pursue it. I think there's a different judgment potentially on error, because I think employers who made an unintentional error, they need to be able to move on. But there's nothing formally to write off. What we write off in our accounts is unpaid debts, and I'm not aware there's any material unpaid debt in relation to COVID. So it's something that we would never give up on. And as I say, we've got a trial underway in Birmingham at the moment. We've got other criminal investigations.
The trial is that which fraud?
That's on furloughs.
That is furloughs.
Yes. But we are, the dedicated resource that we deployed on it, we do not have that anymore. It's just picked up as part of our general risk assessment of other things.
I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that your professional judgment was to curtail those activities. Like all fraud, you're never going to say no, never, but no resources have been allocated to it. And that was based on your judgment of the diminishing returns.
Yes, and that we knew that we could get a higher rate of financial return from those resources if we put them onto other work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Baldwin, just very, very quickly, if we were ever in a situation where we had to implement something like that again at short notice in order to prop up the economy, how would you do things differently?
Thankfully, I'm retiring, but
I hope, Sir Jim, you've left behind some institutional wisdom.
We certainly have. I mean, we have with the Treasury, created a playbook from our experience of doing that. In the case of the furlough, I mean, the key issue for us was what data we had. The better the more up to date the data and the more granular, the better job we could do at reaching the people who needed help and not paying out money to people who didn't need help. We found that we were able to set up the furlough scheme, for example, very, very quickly because we had the digital platform to do that. So, looking back, I think a key lesson was that we had invested in capabilities that you didn't expect to use it for this, but actually just having that capability meant that you were responsive to whatever you were asked to do. So there are benefits that hard business cases don't measure, but actually having up-to-date modern technological capabilities just makes you flexible for whatever you need to turn to do. As a leader at the time, in a sense, I thought, well, I've either put in place the capabilities that will enable us to do this, or I haven't, in which case we won't be able to. And we did have them, but the main issue really was the data that we had access to.
Hence, not self-employed people didn't get anything because you didn't have the data on them. Yep.
I think so, and just saying a bit more about error and fraud. So when we designed those schemes, we estimated that the level of error and fraud would be about 5%, which is what it came in at.
Yeah.
I would like to think, with the kind of things Jim's talking about, maybe we'd be able to estimate 3 or 4% next time. But there is a next time. But there is a compromise to be struck between putting in control and the ability
over perfection.
Well,
ministers did.
It's partly speed, and it's partly the ability for people to be able to apply. Because if you put more anti-error and fraud controls in, it becomes harder for people to apply. So there's a balance there.
In my previous role, HMRC and DWP had well-worn fraud mechanisms, so you understood the risk. There was still a risk. There was still a challenge, but you understood it better. So is there anything that you've left behind or you're going to leave behind to help other departments understand that? Because it was certainly a case that other departments really didn't get it quite as well.
Yes, I mean, one of the things in the playbook is that we had a structured fraud control framework where we made explicit trade-offs and decisions against the other priorities. At the time when we were introducing the furlough scheme, for example, the economy had already closed down. If we didn't get money to people by a certain date, they were simply going to have to lay off their staff. So there was a limit to how much time we could take to put more fraud controls in place, but we had a clear control framework. We understood the risks that we were taking and the extent to which we would be able to manage them pre-payment or try to manage them post-payment.
They might have you on speed dial if anything were to happen again. I know that happened in another department where we asked what would have happened if, and they said, well, it's luckily we had an experienced member of staff still on schedule, and they rang some retired people, so I don't think you'll be off the hook, Sir Jim. That's that, everything. Okay, so Rachel Blake MP.
The HMRC is a supervisor for businesses that are governed by money laundering regulations, and you did 3,629 interventions in the last financial year. To what extent does your anti-money laundering capacity actually compete with some of your other teams for resource?
Anti-money laundering supervision is paid for from the fees that we charge the... Entirely, yes. So, it's kind of ring-fenced. We can't use that money for other purposes, but nor do I use my sort of general resources to supplement that.
Would it then be capped?
I was going to say with one
with one caveat. I mean, one thing that we've learned is that in managing tax fraud, the ability to use anti-money laundering regulations is another string to our bow. It's a way of leveraging open the case. So, I guess when we were made a money laundering supervisor, I would have been a skeptic about whether this was something the department ought to be doing, because it was kind of slightly off mission. But actually, it can be a quite useful power for us to have as a tax authority as well as an anti-money laundering supervisor. So my fraud investigation service, for example, will use it as a means of managing tax fraud. But generally speaking, we've got a sort of contained workforce which is paid by the supervision fees. We cannot use that money for anything else, and we generally don't supplement it with other resources.
Just on the point of supplementing and potentially needing to supplement, how are you assessing whether or not the fees are enough to be exposing the extent of money laundering?
Obviously there's a central body that we feed into together with the other supervisors, and those fees have been adjusted over time. I mean, HMRC is in the position where we're sort of supervisor of last resort, so we supervise all those bodies, all those organisations who are not otherwise in a body that supervises them. So, they tend to be the smaller organisations and the less formal organisations. So we've got particular challenges, I think, in our customer base. So we've had to devote a lot of our resources to educating them, actually, rather than, because a lot of them are not people who are deliberately breaching the regulations. They've been unaware that they are supposed to comply with them, for example, or not having the sophistication to understand how to do that. So a big part of our task is actually education and support as well as enforcement.
Which sector that's concentrated in?
Yeah, so we're responsible for money service businesses, so that can be like bureau de change, for example.
And is it that where you're needing to do most?
Well, that's just one of them. But estate agencies and letting agencies, the art market, they are not subject to a lot of sort of oversight from a professional body. They can be relatively small. They can be quite fluid. They don't necessarily have to be qualified to do their job. So it's that end of the market that HMRC deals with.
Thank you very much. Very quick one from you and Jan.
Just quickly, thank you, Chair. Just quickly on assets held offshore. Are you able to look at assets in other people's names, for example, in names of trusts or shell companies, or are you only really looking at the specific people that you're considering money laundering investigations on?
So I can't speak with authority on money laundering. I mean, certainly when it comes to tax compliance, we have healthy exchange of information with other tax authorities, increasingly able to identify the beneficial ownership, so see-through corporations and trusts. We have for the first time this year come up with a measure of how much of the tax gap relates to offshore income and assets. So yes, and that is a sort of continuing process internationally, and making sure that countries have got good registers, for example, of beneficial ownership and good exchange of information.
So that tax gap review does include assets held in other people's names offshore?
So we've put out effectively experimental statistics, or statistics in development, about the offshore tax gap. It is about UK taxpayers who have income that is shared, details of which are shared with us under the automatic exchange of information arrangements with overseas companies, and who have not declared it or not fully declared it. And we identified about £300 million in that tax gap. So it is a partial measure of the overall offshore gap, and it is experimental, but it's the first time we've been able to do it.
We'll keep an eye on that then. Bobby Dean MP.
Thanks. The budget contained measures on registering those providing tax advice, so just wanted to get your thoughts, if you can outline on what the need for this is really, and do you think the proposed action is going to be sufficient to tackle rogue advisors?
We have. I mean, the tax system is highly intermediated. The vast majority of tax advisors and agents help their clients to comply, to make sure they pay what they owe and no more than what they owe, and so they add value to the tax system. But unfortunately, there are some who do not, and we have seen in recent years a sort of concentration of agents in encouraging people to make repayment claims, for example, or in R&D relief, where they have, far from adding value to tax administration, they have been sort of abusing the tax system, so encouraging their clients to put in claims that are not substantiated and are not eligible. That is abusing the tax system, but is also often abusing their clients as well. So the clients may not be fully aware of what's being done in their name. They may not realise that we could come along afterwards and recover the tax from them, and they have lost out because of the fees they've paid to these agents. So in our interests and in the interests of our customers, we have been tightening up the rules around what agents can do to make sure that they behave responsibly. And as you say, it's been announced that they must be registered with us to submit claims on their client's behalf and be nominated to receive the repayment. If they're not registered, we will not make the repayment to the agent, and that's a key part usually of their business model, that it go through their hands so they can deduct their fee on the way past, and that will hopefully improve standards. But it's just one step, I think, in an ongoing process.
And you mentioned some people may not realise what's done in their name, and something else that came up in the budget review is about revisiting the loan charge scandal. I don't know if you want to add anything on the record about the new review, or indeed HMRC's role in the previous review, and if you have any reflections on that in relation to what we've just been talking about.
So, the government has announced that it is going to have a review of the loan charge. Details of that have not been published, and we need to wait and see what that is. And obviously, HMRC will implement whatever the recommendations the government accepts. My job and HMRC's job is to enforce the law. We have, and clearly, to tackle tax avoidance and to make sure that tax that is due is paid, and that's all that we've been trying to do. The loan charge was introduced in 2016 with the intention of drawing a line under the historical use of disguised remuneration tax avoidance, which has been a problem for 2-3 decades, and is still an ongoing, it's a key part of the mass marketed avoidance that we see today. But obviously it was very controversial. We know that behind every case there is there's a human being. Some people will have had a good awareness and understanding of what they were getting involved in, and will have known that HMRC was likely to challenge them and will have been ready for that. Others have been misled by their advisors and therefore find themselves facing a big tax bill from HMRC that they were not anticipating they would have, and finding that very stressful. And our job is to support people who are faced with potentially life-changing bills that they don't know how they're going to pay. But as far as the new review is concerned, HMRC awaits the outcome of it.
Just one question. So do you think these two things might be related, the registration of HMRC with HMRC of future tax advisors? Do you think that we might need to have stronger regulation in the future to prevent this sort of thing happening again? I accept what you say, that some will have been aware of what they'll get involved in, but how much do you think we need to be put on to the taxpayer versus the authorities who have the widest knowledge of the tax system? Should we have mandatory professional bodies, for example?
So the government has recently consulted on whether there should be regulation of the tax profession and what the options for that are. At the budget, the government said that they were sort of holding their counsel on that, and they're going to, which is understandable. So they've announced some measures that we are going to take forward, but the question of which option, if any, for regulation of the profession is adopted is something that we will have to wait and see. On the specific issue of avoidance, obviously we have been given quite extensive powers to tackle promoters of avoidance in recent years, particularly in 2021 and 2022, and in the budget on the 30th of October, the Chancellor announced that we will be getting further powers to tackle promoters. So they are a particularly egregious end of the system, not necessarily the people that this registration measure is aimed at. That's aimed more, I think, at agents who are marketing to the mass market repayment claim services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Chair. Just to go back to the question we had on social media strategies, if I may ask Ms. Lloyd, I just want a yes/no. Do you know if you're on TikTok or not?
I don't believe we are on TikTok.
If you say you don't believe, you carefully worded that, so if you find that you are, I'm sure you're right to...
so if it's any different, we'll let you know.
Yeah. We're just interested as different bits of government are doing different things. But can I thank you very much indeed for coming to see us today. Well, you didn't have any option really, did you? But, but we like to put it politely. In summary today, we've heard that you've got no future plans to close the phone lines, which I think will relieve quite a lot of our constituents, and that you are now meeting your target service standards, which wasn't the case earlier this year. Also, we had obviously an interesting discussion about how AI can be used in meaningful ways to provide customer service and identify trends for tax collections. And I think we'll want to quiz you more in future with your successes on how AI is being used, and that staff who are being taken off tax collecting roles have already been kept on and are raising more tax. So again, we'll be watching those figures. We've all seen many a red book in our time, and we want to watch to see that they're being kept to, and that you could be raising more money with more staff, but there is a big challenge about recruiting in large volumes, which I think we've seen that before. So I think we'll work out what our messages will be to the Treasury Minister, and we may well have James Murray MP in front of us before long, as he's got the only excuse that you can dodge a Treasury Select Committee hearing, and he's in the House now dealing with the finance bill. So we felt that was a reasonable excuse, but that's the only one. But can I thank you all very much indeed? And so Jim, I hope this won't quite be the last time. He says we would love to tempt you back for one last time before you actually retire. When you no longer have to worry about what anyone will say about what you've told us. But if we don't see you, can we just wish you all the very best of luck in retirement? It's been great to have. We may have had our differences at times, but to have a tax specialist in charge of HMRC did bring some shift to the delivery of the department compared with some people who had, I'm sure, great things to offer but weren't all tax specialists. So can I thank Sir Jim Harra, Justin Holliday and Myrtle Lloyd very much indeed. Order.